I knew something was wrong the moment I heard the jackhammers. It was a Saturday morning, and I had just stepped onto my porch, coffee in hand, expecting to enjoy the peace of my backyard. Instead, there were construction workers tearing up my lawn. My lawn. I rushed down the steps, barely registering the bright orange vests of the workers before I spotted her Harriet Hensley, the HOA president, standing with her arms crossed, surveying the destruction like a queen inspecting her kingdom. "Harriet!" I shouted, marching toward her. "What in the world is going on here?" She turned slowly, giving me that thin-lipped, self-satisfied expression that made my blood boil. "Oh, good morning, Samuel," she said, voice dripping with fake politeness. "Isn't it wonderful? The HOA finally approved the new community tennis courts. They're going right here, prime location." I blinked at her, my brain struggling to process the sheer audacity. "This is my property," I barked. "You can't just build a tennis court on my lawn." Harriet raised a perfectly plucked eyebrow. "Well, technically, the HOA reviewed the boundary maps and determined that this land falls under communal space." "That's a lie," I shot back. "I have the deed to prove it." She gave a little shrug. "Then you'll need to take that up with the board. But the construction permits have already been approved. I suggest you get used to the idea of having a tennis court in your yard." I clenched my fists. I had seen Harriet pull her power-hungry stunts before issuing fines for unsightly flower beds, forcing people to repaint their houses' arbitrary colors, and even having a neighbor's shed torn down for being too tall. But this was blatant theft. I wasn't going to stand for it. I stormed back inside, already forming a plan. Harriet and her minions had no idea who they were messing with. By the time I was done, she wouldn't just be regretting this little stunt, she'd be handing me the keys to her office. I didn't waste any time. The moment I stepped back inside my house, I grabbed the deed from my filing cabinet. There it was, clear as day, my property lines, legally recorded and indisputable. Harriet and her HOA cronies had either ignored this or outright fabricated their own version of the boundaries. Either way, I was about to put an end to their little construction project before it got any further. I snapped a few pictures of the workers tearing up my lawn, making sure to capture the damage they were doing. Then I called the city's zoning office. It took a little persistence, but eventually, I got someone on the line who confirmed that no such communal space designation had ever been approved for my property. That was all I needed. I marched back outside. The workers had already started laying stakes and marking off where the court would go. Harriet was still standing there, looking mighty pleased with herself. I stepped right up to her, holding my phone out. "I just got off the phone with the zoning office. They have no record of any communal designation for this property. You're trespassing." She barely batted an eye. "That doesn't concern me, Samuel. The HOA has the authority to make adjustments where needed for the betterment of the community." I let out a sharp laugh. "You don't have the authority to override property deeds. You're destroying private property." Harriet waved a dismissive hand. "If you have a problem, you're welcome to file a complaint with the board. But construction is moving forward." I turned to the workers. "Pack it up. You're trespassing. If you don't stop now, I'll be calling the police." One of the workers hesitated. "We were told this was approved by the HOA." Pointed at my deed. "This land belongs to me." "If you continue, you'll be liable for damages." That got their attention. A few of them exchanged uncertain glances. Harriet, however, wasn't backing down. "This is unnecessary, Samuel. The board has discussed this at length. There's nothing you can do to stop it." I locked eyes with her. "Watch me." I turned, walked back inside, and made the call. Within 20 minutes, a patrol car pulled up and 2 officers stepped out. Harriet had the nerve to act surprised. One of the officers approached. "We got a report of unauthorized construction on private property." I handed over my deed. "This is my land. The HOA is trying to build a tennis court without my consent. I want them off my property now." The officer examined the deed, then turned to Harriet. "Ma'am, do you have any legal documentation proving you have rights to this land?" Harriet folded her arms. "The HOA has every right to make improvements to community spaces." The officer wasn't buying it. "That's not what I asked." Do you have any legal documentation saying this land belongs to the HOA? She hesitated for a fraction of a second. The board approved. That's not a legal document, the officer interrupted. Unless you can provide one, your workers need to leave immediately. The workers didn't wait for further argument. They started gathering their tools, clearly not wanting to be involved in whatever mess Harriet had gotten them into. Harriet, meanwhile, looked like she had swallowed a lemon. I watched as the last of the workers packed up their truck and drove off. Harriet turned to me with a tight expression. This isn't over, Samuel. I smiled. Oh, I know. That's why I'm taking it a step further. She narrowed her eyes. What do you mean? I pulled out my phone and snapped a picture of the torn-up ground that had once been my lawn. You're going to pay for the damages. And I'm going to make sure the entire neighborhood knows exactly what kind of scam you're running here. For the first time, she looked genuinely unsettled. You wouldn't dare. I grinned. You don't know me very well, do you? She turned on her heel and stormed off, but I wasn't finished yet. Harriet thought she could bulldoze over people with her authority, but she had made a fatal mistake. She had underestimated me. I spent the next few days gathering everything I needed. I reached out to a few neighbors who had also been victims of Harriet's overreach. Turns out I wasn't the only one who had dealt with her underhanded tactics. One neighbor had been fined repeatedly for having a non-compliant mailbox, even though it was the same model the HOA had approved. Another had been forced to remove a perfectly legal fence because Harriet claimed it obstructed community aesthetics. The more I looked, the more I saw a pattern. Harriet and her board were using their positions to bully homeowners into compliance and, in some cases, outright take their property. That's when I found the golden ticket. I got my hands on the HOA's bylaws, and buried in the fine print was something Harriet had clearly overlooked. A clause that stated if enough homeowners filed complaints against the board, a recall vote could be triggered. I wasted no time. I went door to door, explaining to my neighbors exactly what Harriet had tried to pull with my property. The more people I talked to, the more signatures I collected. By the end of the week, I had more than enough. I submitted the petition, and just like that, the recall vote was set. Harriet must have realized what was happening because suddenly, she was everywhere trying to smooth things over, acting like she had just been misunderstood. But it was too late. The neighborhood had seen her for what she really was. The vote was held in the community center, and when the final count was announced, Harriet was officially removed as HOA president. But the best part? The bylaws also allowed homeowners to nominate a replacement. And guess whose name was at the top of the list? I didn't just stop Harriet from stealing my land, I took her job. Now, with me in charge, things were about to change. With Harriet gone, I wasted no time. The first order of business was undoing the nonsense she had put in place over the years. I called for an emergency HOA meeting, and for the first time in as long as anyone could remember, the room was packed not with people afraid of what new restrictions were coming, but homeowners eager to see the damage undone. I stood at the front of the room, the HOA bylaws open in front of me. I wasn't going to make decisions in secret or manipulate the rules like Harriet had. If we were going to fix this neighborhood, we were going to do it together. The moment the meeting started, voices rose across the room. People had been holding back their grievances for years, afraid of retaliation, but now that Harriet was out, the floodgates opened. A man at the front raised his hand, his face tight with frustration. He had lived here longer than most, and his property had been targeted repeatedly. He wasn't the only one. Another homeowner, a young woman near the back, voiced her anger over a series of escalating fines that had been fabricated against her. Others chimed in, each with their own stories about how Harriet and her board had abused their power. I let them speak. Everyone needed to be heard. When they finished, I made my stance clear. The days of arbitrary fines and fabricated violations were over. To make sure of it, I proposed a full audit of the HOA's finances. That got an immediate reaction. Harriet had ruled like a dictator, but she had also been in charge of the budget. No one had ever questioned where all the collected fines had gone. Now they were about to find out. It didn't take long to find the discrepancies. The HOA's financial records were a mess not because of bad bookkeeping, but because of deliberate mismanagement. Money that should have gone to community maintenance had been funneled elsewhere. A large portion had been used for administrative expenses, a vague term that, when broken down, included lavish dinners, travel reimbursements, and personal purchases that had nothing to do with neighborhood upkeep. The real kicker was the so-called beautification project Harriet had approved, the same one that had nearly stolen my lawn. The budget for it was astronomical, far beyond what a tennis court should have cost. And yet, there were no legitimate receipts, no records of competitive bids, and no official approval from the city's zoning department. The pieces fit together too neatly. Harriet had been using the HOA's funds as her personal bank account, and the tennis court project had just been another way to funnel money into the pockets of whoever was in on the scheme. I wasn't about to let that slide. Armed with the evidence, I called for another meeting, this time inviting a city official who had taken an interest in the case. When I laid out the financial discrepancies in front of the entire neighborhood, the reaction was swift. People who had once feared speaking out stood up, demanding answers. It didn't take long for Harriet's supporters to start backpedaling. Some claimed they had no idea what was going on, that they had simply followed her lead. Others tried to shift blame, but the records spoke for themselves. Every decision, every shady financial move had her name attached to it. And then, as if on cue, the doors at the back of the room opened and in walked two uniformed officers. The city official had reviewed the evidence, and what Harriet had done wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. The room fell silent as the officers approached Harriet, who had been sitting near the back, watching the proceedings with barely concealed disdain. They didn't give her a chance to argue. The moment they read her charges, her face drained of color. She had spent years bending the rules, convinced she was untouchable. But now she was facing real consequences. As the officers led her out, the room erupted. Some people cheered, others whispered in disbelief. But one thing was certain, the neighborhood had been freed from her grip. With Harriet gone for good, I turned my focus to rebuilding. The HOA needed a complete overhaul, and I had every intention of making sure it served the residents, not the other way around. I started by eliminating the ridiculous restrictions Harriet had put in place. No more arbitrary fines, no more unnecessary repainting requirements, and certainly no more fabricated violations. Instead, we focused on real improvements, fixing the sidewalks, repairing the community pool, and actually using the funds for their intended purpose. The best part? The neighborhood came together in a way it never had before. People who had once kept to themselves started working together, helping each other repair the damage Harriet's reign had caused. And as for my lawn? The moment the last remnants of the botched tennis court project were removed, I took my time restoring it. Every blade of grass that grew back was a reminder that no one, not even a power-hungry HOA president, could take what was mine. Harriet had thought she could control everything. But in the end, she had only ensured her own downfall. And as I stood on my porch, watching the neighborhood finally thrive, I knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning of something better. With Harriet gone and the neighborhood finally free from her control, I wasted no time putting real changes into effect. No more arbitrary fines, no more shady deals, and certainly no more fabricated rules meant to squeeze money out of homeowners. I had spent weeks going through every document, every financial record, and every HOA bylaw to make sure we never ended up under the rule of another power-hungry dictator. The first major change was transparency. Every HOA meeting was now open to the residents, and every financial decision had to be publicly posted. No more secret budgets or unexplained expenses. If the HOA was going to collect money, it was going to be used properly with full accountability. One evening, I sat in my newly restored backyard, enjoying the quiet that had been missing for so long. The damage from the attempted tennis court had finally been repaired, and my property was back to the way it should have been all along. Just as I was about to head inside, I noticed a familiar figure standing near the sidewalk. It was Greg, one of Harriet's former board members. Greg had been one of the quieter ones during Harriet's reign, never actively opposing her but never fully endorsing her worst ideas either. Now, he stood there with an uncertain expression, clearly debating whether or not to approach. I met him at the edge of my lawn, arms crossed. He shifted awkwardly before speaking. "I heard about the new financial policies," he said. "You're really making everything public?" I nodded. "That's the whole point. No more hidden agendas. People deserve to know where their money is going." He hesitated, then exhaled. "You know, I never agreed with everything Harriet did, but she had a way of making people feel like they didn't have a choice. You either went along with her, or you became her next target. That's how people like her operate," I said. "Fear and control. But that's over now." Greg rubbed the back of his neck. I want to make things right. If you need help cleaning up the mess she left behind, I'm willing to step up. I studied him for a moment. He had been complicit, yes, but unlike Harriet, he seemed to recognize the damage that had been done. And if I was going to rebuild this HOA properly, I needed people who were willing to own up to their mistakes and work towards something better. All right, I said. But if you're serious about this, you're going to have to be part of making things right. That means reviewing old fines, reimbursing people who were unfairly charged, and making sure this HOA never turns into a power grab again. Greg nodded, determination settling into his features. I can do that. With that, another piece of Harriet's influence was erased. Over the next few weeks, we dug deep into the HOA's history, uncovering years of unfair charges, misused funds, and even more underhanded tactics Harriet had used to hold onto power. The more we found, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about control, it had been about greed. One of the most shocking discoveries was a series of property value assessments that Harriet had manipulated to justify excessive fees on certain homeowners. She had been deliberately targeting people who either didn't have the time or the resources to fight back, using the HOA's authority to drain them financially. That led to the next major change, reversing the damage. I organized a neighborhood meeting, laying out everything we had uncovered. The shock on people's faces was undeniable. Some had suspected they were being unfairly targeted, but seeing the full extent of it written out in black and white was something else entirely. It was time to make things right. We voted to return all improperly collected fines, using the recovered funds from Harriet's fraudulent expenses. Homeowners who had been forced to repaint their houses under bogus rules were reimbursed for the costs. Even the unnecessary landscaping changes Harriet had mandated were undone, restoring yards and gardens to the way people actually wanted them. For the first time in years, the HOA wasn't something people feared. It was something that actually worked for them. But not everyone was thrilled with the changes. One afternoon, as I was reviewing the final details of the reimbursement plan, I got an unexpected visitor, Harriet's closest ally, Linda. She had been one of the most vocal supporters of Harriet's rule, always the first to enforce her ridiculous fines and the last to admit any wrongdoing. Linda wasted no time making her displeasure known. You've completely dismantled everything we built, she said, her tone sharp. This HOA had order, structure. Now it's chaos. Order. I raised an eyebrow. You mean the kind where homeowners lived in fear of ridiculous fines? Where people had to fight just to keep their own property? Linda crossed her arms tightly. Harriet knew how to keep things under control. You think letting people do whatever they want is going to make this neighborhood better? I leaned forward slightly. What I think is that people deserve to live in their own homes without being treated like criminals over mailbox designs. She scoffed. You're making a mistake. Without rules, this place will fall apart. I gestured toward the neighborhood around us. Take a look, Linda. People are talking again. They're helping each other. Nobody is living in fear of some fabricated violation showing up in their mailbox. If that's what you call chaos, then I'll take it over what Harriet was doing any day. Linda's lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't used to being challenged. Harriet had always handled that part. Now that she was gone, Linda didn't know how to navigate without someone backing her up. You'll regret this, she said eventually. People will see that they need real leadership, and when they do, they'll realize you're not it. I gave her a steady look. If leadership means abusing power and taking advantage of homeowners, then no, I'm not it. And I never will be. Linda didn't have a response to that. She turned on her heel and walked away, but I knew this wasn't the last I'd hear from her. Still, it didn't matter. The neighborhood had already decided what kind of HOA they wanted, and it wasn't one built on fear. The final step in the cleanup was rewriting the bylaws to remove any loopholes that could allow another Harriet to rise again. Any changes to HOA policies now required a unanimous board vote and homeowner approval. Financial records were made permanently accessible, and any attempt to enact new fees had to be reviewed by an independent auditor. With those protections in place, the neighborhood was finally safe from the kind of control Harriet had once wielded. As I stood at the front of the final meeting, looking out at the gathered homeowners, I could see the difference already. There was no tension, no whispered worries about what new rule might be forced on them next. This wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was a community. And as far as I was concerned, that was the greatest victory of all. With the last of the major changes in place, the neighborhood had finally settled into a rhythm of trust and cooperation. The HOA, once a tool for control and manipulation, had become what it was supposed to be, a way to help the community, not dictate it. But just because Harriet was gone didn't mean all the problems disappeared. There were still remnants of her influence, people who had benefited from her rule who weren't happy about the new era of fairness. Some of them had been on the board with her, others had been the enforcers of her ridiculous rules. And while many had backed down after seeing the community turn against them, a few weren't ready to give up. It started subtly. Small disruptions, attempts to stir up dissatisfaction. Someone had gone around the neighborhood posting anonymous flyers claiming that the new HOA leadership was too lenient, that without strict enforcement, the property values would plummet. Then came the rumors, whispers, that I was planning to dissolve the HOA entirely, that I was secretly planning to sell off community assets, that I was pushing my own agenda just as much as Harriet had. I wasn't surprised. People who had held power for so long didn't just fade away quietly. But I wasn't about to let them claw their way back in with lies and manipulation. One evening, Greg stopped by. His expression was tight, frustration clear on his face. He had been working hard to undo the damage his former allies had helped create, and now he was dealing with their backlash firsthand. "They're trying to rally people against you," he said. "A few of them have been going door to door, talking about restoring order. They're acting like you've let the whole place fall apart." I leaned back in my chair, considering. I had expected some resistance, but I hadn't thought they'd be bold enough to try and organize so soon after Harriet's downfall. "Are they getting any traction?" I asked. Greg shook his head. "Not much. Most people are happy with the changes, but you know how it is, if you tell a lie loud enough, someone's going to believe it." That was exactly what worried me. The last thing I needed was for these people to start chipping away at the progress we had made. "They're going to try something bigger soon," Greg continued. "They know they can't just talk their way back in, so they'll try to force the issue." And he was right. A week later, I got a formal notice. An official petition had been submitted demanding a special vote to reinstate some of the old policies Harriet had put in place. They were trying to use the system against me, twisting the HOA bylaws to make a move before we had the chance to fully secure the reforms. The petition had the minimum number of signatures needed to force a vote, which meant I had no choice but to hold a meeting and let the community decide. That was fine by me. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one. On the night of the vote, the community center was packed. More people had shown up than at any meeting in years. The air was thick with tension, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. At the front of the room, the former board members who had sided with Harriet sat together, trying to project confidence. Linda was among them, watching me with that same hard expression she had worn the last time we spoke. I stepped forward and addressed the crowd. "The petitioners claim that we need to reinstate some of the old policies," I said. "They say we've lost control of the neighborhood, that the changes we've made are dangerous." I let my words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "So let's talk about what those policies actually were." I pulled out a stack of documents, the same ones we had uncovered during the financial review. These are records of fines issued under the old policies. Hundreds of them, many of them completely fabricated. I held them up for everyone to see. These aren't about maintaining the neighborhood. These were about power. About taking money from homeowners and putting it in the pockets of a few people at the top. Murmurs spread through the crowd. People were remembering the ridiculous fines, the arbitrary rules, the way they had been forced to comply under threat of financial ruin. I turned my gaze toward the petitioners. And let's not forget where those funds actually went. I held up another document. Lavish dinners. Personal expenses. Not a single dollar was spent on real improvements. They weren't protecting your property values. They were protecting their own interests. Greg stepped forward and added to my point. And now they want to bring it all back. Think about why. The petitioners shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Linda opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, someone from the crowd spoke up. "We already voted them out once," the homeowner said. "Why would we let them back in?" Another voice chimed in. "I didn't move here to be bullied. I'm not signing up for that again." One by one, the homeowners spoke up, shutting down every argument before the petitioners even had a chance to make their case. By the time the vote was called, the result was overwhelming. The petition was rejected. The old policies would not be returning. And just like that, the last remnants of Harriet's control crumbled. After the meeting, as people filtered out, Greg turned to me with a relieved expression. "That was close." I shook my head. "Not really. They were never going to win. People just needed to be reminded of what they were fighting for. And with that, the last of Harriet's influence was gone for good. The neighborhood was finally free. With the final vote shutting down the last of Harriet's influence, I finally had a moment to breathe. The neighborhood was safe, the power-hungry board members had been ousted, and the HOA was functioning the way it was supposed to. But just because the battle was won didn't mean there weren't loose ends to tie up. The first issue was the financial aftermath of Harriet's reign. While we had reversed the worst of her policies and reimbursed homeowners for unjust fines, there was still the matter of the money she had siphoned off. Some of it had been recovered, but a significant portion was still unaccounted for. That meant one thing: we needed to find out where it went. Greg had been helping me sift through old records, and after weeks of digging, we finally found something interesting. During her time in power, Harriet had authorized several infrastructure improvements that had never materialized. Payments had been made to a contracting company that didn't exist, at least not on paper. That was enough to warrant a deeper investigation. I took the information to the city's fraud department, and with their resources, it didn't take long to uncover the truth. The fake contracting company was linked to one of Harriet's relatives. She had been funneling HOA funds into a shell company, laundering money right under everyone's noses. With this new evidence, the case against Harriet escalated. She was already facing charges for financial mismanagement, but now she was looking at full-blown fraud and embezzlement. When the news broke, the neighborhood was livid. It wasn't just about the money, it was about trust. Harriet had spent years pretending to care about the community while robbing it blind. The final blow came when the city filed a civil suit against her to recover the stolen funds. That meant not only was she facing criminal charges, but she was also about to lose everything she had gained from her corruption. Her house, her assets, everything she had built on her scams, it was all being stripped away. With Harriet officially out of the picture, it was time to look to the future. The HOA wasn't just about undoing damage anymore, it was about making the neighborhood better. One of the first initiatives we introduced was a community improvement fund. Instead of arbitrary fines, we created a voluntary donation system where homeowners could contribute to actual projects: repaving sidewalks, fixing streetlights, even adding a playground for the kids. The difference was night and day. Instead of resentment, people were excited to participate, knowing their money was being used for something real. The changes also brought something unexpected: new residents. Word had spread about how the HOA had been reformed, and suddenly people who had once avoided HOA neighborhoods were interested in moving in. That meant higher property values, but not because of fear-based enforcement. People wanted to live here because it was a real community. One evening, as I walked through the neighborhood, I saw something that made me pause. Families sitting on their porches, neighbors chatting without the tension that had once hung over them. The atmosphere had completely transformed. Greg joined me, glancing around with the same sense of satisfaction. "This place looks different," he said. "It feels different," I replied. "People aren't afraid anymore." He nodded. "We did that." And he was right. The HOA wasn't a weapon anymore. It was a tool for the people who lived here, and as long as I was in charge, it would stay that way. Harriet had tried to build an empire on control and greed, but in the end, all she had done was pave the way for something better. As I made my way back home, I looked at the lawn that had nearly been stolen from me. It was green, thriving, untouched by the destruction Harriet had tried to bring. A perfect symbol of everything we had rebuilt.